Rome is remembered for marble, law, roads, and legions. But the capital also depended on something easier to miss: grain ships crossing the Mediterranean. Under Augustus, the Roman state treated grain supply as a matter of public stability. Under Claudius, Rome invested in harbor works at Portus because the city needed safer access to the sea. This was not about taste, it was about order. A delay in Egypt, a storm near the coast, a warehouse shortage at Ostia, or a rumor in a Roman market could turn wheat into politics. The same pressure returned in France before the Revolution, when Turgot's grain reforms collided with public fear and the Flour War of 1775 sent crowds against merchants and officials. It returned in Chicago, where the Board of Trade turned wheat into contracts before the grain arrived. And it returned around the Black Sea, where war, ports, insurance, and export corridors could move food prices far beyond the battlefield. So this is not simply the history of bread. It is the history of how wheat became storage, tax, empire, riot, market, and geopolitical pressure. Before wheat became Rome's supply problem, France's street problem, Chicago's market problem, or the Black Sea's global problem, it was a wild grass in Southwest Asia. For most of human history, no emperor waited for grain ships. No Roman official managed the annona. No French minister defended a grain policy. No Chicago trader watched a futures price. No government studied Black Sea export corridors. People survived by moving through landscapes. They hunted, gathered, fished, remembered seasons, followed animals, and learned which plants could be found in which places. Food was difficult, but it was not yet locked into a single field, a single storehouse, or a single tax system. In Southwest Asia, wild cereals grew in the open landscape. Wheat was not yet a crop obedient to farmers. It was a grass that ripened, scattered seed, and waited for anyone who knew how to cut it, carry it, grind it, and make it edible. The first historical object is not a crown. It is a grinding stone. Hands press wild grain against rock. Seeds crack. Dust gathers. A hard cereal becomes meal. This is not yet civilization. It is labor, repeated until the body learns the rhythm. At Shubaika 1 in northeastern Jordan, archaeologists found evidence of bread-like food made from wild plants roughly 14,400 years ago. That does not mean bread created civilization. It means people were experimenting with the possibilities of grain before full farming became the center of life. Then people learned to do something even more important: a storage pit. In the Jordan Valley, evidence for pre-domestication granaries suggests that storage appeared before full domestication. Food no longer had to disappear the moment it was gathered. It could be placed under watch. Dry grain could wait in a pit, basket, room, or later a granary. It could carry part of one season into another. That changed the future. A meal feeds the present. Stored wheat makes tomorrow visible. But once tomorrow is visible, tomorrow can be guarded. Authority begins when access to stored grain depends on someone else's decision. Around that storage pit stand families, elders, guards, and people who remember the last hungry season. If the pit is full, the group can wait. If it empties too early, the group is exposed. Wheat did not create civilization by itself, but it created a kind of object that later states would love: durable, visible, divisible, portable, and worth guarding. That object leads from Shubaika and the Jordan Valley toward Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome, France, Chicago, and the Black Sea. The chain begins with a simple pressure: who controls the stored future after harvest? An early farming village faced a new problem. The grain was gathered, but someone had to decide how it would be used. The fields have been cut. Bundles of wheat and barley lie near mud brick houses. Baskets move toward a storage area. Dust hangs in the air. A family says its plot produced more than another. An elder says seed must be saved. Someone argues that a sick child needs food now. At the edge of the storage pit, a man stands guard. He is not a king, not yet, but he is already standing between people and stored grain. This is not only farming, it is distribution. Someone decides whether grain becomes food now, seed for later, payment for labor, or reserve against bad weather. The guard is not a state official yet, but his role points toward one, someone who controls access to stored grain. In Mesopotamia, scribes will press delivery marks into clay. In Egypt, officials will record harvests along the Nile. In Rome, administrators will worry about the Annona. In France, ministers will discover that grain policy can ignite crowds. The village shows the same pressure before it becomes a formal state system. Wheat rewarded return. In the long movement from the Jordan Valley toward Mesopotamian and Egyptian grain states, fields had to be prepared. Seed had to be saved. Harvest had to be timed. Grain had to be dried and protected. A mobile group could leave a failing place more easily. A farming village could not walk away without losing the field, the seed, the store, and the labor already invested. The storage pit tied people to place. The division of stored grain tied people to authority. Once grain is gathered, someone needs to know how much exists. Once it is measured, someone can remember who delivered it, who received it, and who still owes something. The storage pit leads to the measuring container. The measuring container leads to the record leads to the state. That is how a local storage problem leads toward Mesopotamia and Egypt. Before writing, the argument happens beside the storehouse. After writing, the argument can survive on clay. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed marks into wet clay to record grain, labor, and obligations. In Mesopotamia, grain, labor canals, temples, and writing became part of the same administrative world. Barley was often the dominant cereal in southern Mesopotamia, while wheat belonged to the wider cereal economy. Cereal grain could be measured, stored, recorded, redistributed, and demanded. A clay tablet lets an institution remember how much grain came in, who delivered it, which workers received rations, which fields were expected to produce, which obligations remained unpaid. The scribe records, the temple stores, the palace demands, the worker receives, the farmer owes. At this point, grain is no longer just sitting in a container. It is being recorded, owed, and controlled by an institution. The political theorist, James C. Scott, has argued that cereal grains were unusually friendly to early states because they were visible, divisible, accessible, storable, and taxable. That argument is not a single key to all history, but it captures a real pressure. Power prefers resources it can see and count. Herds move. Fish vanish into water. Wild food spread across forests and wetlands. Grain waits in fields at harvest time and sits in storage afterward. That made grain attractive to officials. Now look at Egypt. Along the Nile, flood, field, harvest, granary, scribe, and official formed another grain world. Egyptian administration could collect harvests, store them, support workers, and provision temples and royal projects. The granary was not just an economic building, it was state architecture. At the granary door, farmers, porters, scribes, and guards meet around the same harvest. Farmers arrive with grain. Porters carry sacks. Scribes record amounts. Guards watch the entrance. Officials decide where the stored harvest goes inside the building. Grain is no longer only the product of a field. It is part of a state. A ruler who can claim grain can feed laborers. A palace that feeds laborers can build, dig, move, repair, and fight. A temple that stores grain can support specialists who do not farm every day. The next object is the ration bowl. A worker digging a canal or building a wall may not be paid in coin. He may receive grain. That ration keeps him alive, but it also ties him to the institution that distributes it. Grain becomes wage. Grain becomes obligation. Grain becomes labor command. The early state is not only a king on a monument, it is a record, a measure, a storehouse, a ration, and a tax claim. The scribe acts, the official counts, the granary stores, the worker depends, the ruler claims. And once cities grow beyond nearby fields, the grain problem changes scale. The question is no longer only who controls the village store. The question becomes how a city feeds people who do not live near the fields. That question leads to Rome. Rome shows the grain system at imperial scale, not because wheat alone made Rome powerful. Rome had armies, slavery, roads, law, taxation, engineering, violence, and political institutions. But Rome shows what happens when a capital becomes too large to treat grain as a private detail. At that scale, wheat becomes logistics. Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt became deeply important grain regions for Rome. After Egypt came under Roman control, Egyptian harvests became part of the imperial food system. The capital depended on grain moving through fields, rivers, ports, ships, warehouses, merchants, officials, and weather. Augustus understood that grain supply was a political matter. A Roman ruler could not allow the capital to believe that bread and grain were outside public responsibility. The annona became one of the ways Roman power connected distant harvests to urban stability. Later, Claudius ordered major harbor works at Portus to improve Rome's access to maritime supply. The engineering project was not only a monument, it was a response to the physical danger of feeding a huge city through the sea. The chain stretched from Egyptian fields to Roman warehouses in Egypt. Grain is harvested under a hard sun, sacks are measured, cargo moves down the Nile, ships are loaded near the coast, crews watch season and wind, grain crosses the Mediterranean, ports receive it, warehouses fill, officials record it, merchants bargain over it, bakers wait for flour, crowds listen for rumors. This is not a romantic image of empire, it is a maintenance problem. The key Roman object is the warehouse. At Ostia and near the route to Rome, stored grain became the physical proof of imperial dependence. Every sack said the same thing: the center depends on the periphery. The annona did not mean Rome fed every person equally or controlled every loaf. Private trade, status, state intervention, market behavior, and policy all mattered. But the political point is clear. Roman officials could not ignore grain: a storm at sea, a delay in Egypt, a bad harvest in North Africa, a dishonest measure, a port problem, or a rumor in the market could travel toward the capital as anxiety. Grain had to keep arriving. That is the hidden burden of empire. A monument can stand after it is built, a road can remain after the workers leave, but grain must arrive again and again. Last year's cargo does not feed this year's crowd. Power has to eat daily. Augustus and Claudius show that Roman grain supply was not only an economic background, it was a political and infrastructural problem handled by emperors. The Roman warehouse leads to the bread queue, because once people expect grain to arrive, failure becomes political. A Roman citizen in the street may think about bread, a merchant thinks about price, an official thinks about supply, a ship captain thinks about weather. A farmer in Egypt thinks about harvest and obligation. All of them are connected by the same grain chain. Rome shows the system fully grown. Grain had become a matter of imperial stability. The storage pit has become a warehouse. The measuring container has become state administration. The village guard has become public order. The dispute over who receives grain has become a question of imperial legitimacy. If Rome's grain system holds, the city feels stable. If it strains, the weakness of empire appears not only at the frontier but in the market and the street. Marble above, grain below. For ordinary people, wheat rarely appears as an imperial supply system. It appears as bread, a loaf in a shop, a price at a stall, a queue outside a bakery, a flour cart moving through a crowded street, a rumor that merchants are hiding grain, a mother counting coins and realizing yesterday's money buys less today. Bread matters here because its price is where grain pressure reached ordinary people. In France, that pressure became explosive. The French Revolution was not caused by bread alone. Fiscal crisis, social inequality, political conflict, Enlightenment ideas, royal weakness, bad harvests, and institutional failure all mattered. But bread helped turn pressure into action. In 1774, Anne Robert Jacques Turgot became Controller General of Finances under Louis XVI. Turgot believed grain trade should be freer, and his reforms tried to loosen restrictions on the movement and sale of grain. Then came the Flour War of 1775. Crowds feared that liberalized grain trade allowed merchants to profit while bread became unaffordable. They attacked grain convoys, pressured bakers, forced sales, and challenged officials. Whether every rumor was true is not the point. The political meaning was clear. People believed grain was too important to be governed only by distant markets and official theory. Turgot saw policy. The crowd saw hunger. Louis XVI saw that grain could become a royal crisis. At this point, wheat has entered street politics. First came price, then rumor. Someone was hiding grain, someone was exporting flour, someone was profiting, someone in power knew and did nothing. Then came action. Crowds searched warehouses, stopped carts, pressured bakers, demanded fair prices or forced sales. They were not only asking for food, they were enforcing an expectation. Survival could not be priced beyond reach while grain existed somewhere nearby. For the poor, a grain price was not an abstract market signal. It decided whether the household could endure the week. If people believed bread was unfairly expensive, the failure was not only in the market, it became a failure of order. A minister could speak in policy, a king could speak in authority. The crowd answered by stopping carts, pressuring bakers, and demanding affordable bread. The same chain appears in another form. Storage created authority, counting created tax, supply created empire, and price created unrest. French streets show why governments feared grain markets. People did not need to see the whole system to feel its failure. They only needed to see the loaf shrink, the price rise, the flour cart pass, or the baker close the door. The buyer does not see the field, the granary, the tax record, or the port. What they see is the price of bread. That visibility turns a hidden supply chain into public anger. And as cities grew, states and merchants searched for a way to move grain faster, store it at greater scale, and price it before crisis arrived. The flour cart leads to the grain elevator. Industrial wheat does not begin as a golden field. It begins as a grain elevator beside rail tracks. In 19th century North America, Chicago became the historical anchor for this transformation. Railroads pulled wheat from inland fields toward mills, cities, ports, and export routes. Elevators made storage vertical and industrial standard grades, helped buyers and sellers trade wheat without knowing every field it came from. Dust filled the air. Rail cars waited. Bulk wheat was poured, lifted, graded, mixed, stored, and moved. The elevator was not just storage, it was a machine that turned local harvests into standardized commodity. Inside the elevator, wheat lost part of its local identity. A farmer saw weather, soil, debt, family labor, and a specific field. The market saw grade, weight, moisture, delivery, and price. Founded in 1848, the Chicago Board of Trade helped create a central place where buyers and sellers could formalize grain trade. Forward contracts, and later standardized futures contracts, turned the promise of future delivery into something that could be traded at scale. This sounds financial, but the old fear is still underneath. Will there be enough wheat? What will it cost? Who carries the risk if weather changes, harvests fail, transport slows, or demand rises? Ancient granaries stored grain against the future. Chicago priced grain before the future arrived. The tool changed, but the old fear remained. Would enough wheat arrive, and what would it cost? On the trading floor, hand signal, prices move, and men watch boards. A number changes in Chicago and somewhere else. A miller, farmer, exporter, or buyer sees tomorrow differently. This is not food culture. This is wheat as infrastructure, finance, and urban dependence. Industrial wheat made it possible for cities to eat grain grown far away, but it also meant local bread prices could be shaped by weather, transport, speculation, and market signals far beyond the street where bread was bought. The grain elevator solved one problem, moving wheat at scale. It created another, dependence on a system too large for most people to see. The elevator deserves to be seen beside the Roman warehouse. A Roman warehouse concentrated imperial cargo. A modern elevator standardized commodity grain. Both buildings hid the field and revealed the system. The futures contract belongs beside the clay tablet. The tablet recorded what had been delivered or owed. The contract recorded what would be delivered or risked. The history of wheat keeps returning to the same question in new forms. How can societies control grain before hunger arrives? By the 20th and 21st centuries, that question no longer belonged to one city, one empire, or one exchange. It belonged to global trade. The futures contract leads to the Black Sea port. The modern echo of Rome is not marble, it is a port. Grain terminals, storage silos, cargo ships, rail lines, export permits, insurance documents, weather reports, government meetings. The objects have changed, but the chain is familiar. Fields still have to produce, ports still have to function, ships still have to move, prices still have to remain survivable. The Black Sea grain trade shows why wheat is still geopolitical. Russia and Ukraine are major players in global grain markets. When war disrupts fields, ports, storage, shipping, insurance, or export corridors, the effects do not remain local. They move through contracts, import bills, food subsidies, prices, and political anxiety in countries far from the battlefield. This is not the same empire, but the dependency is familiar. One region's harvest can become another region's stability. A harvest in one region becomes stability somewhere else. A blocked port becomes pressure in another capital. A damaged export corridor becomes a price signal in countries that did not fire a shot. Modern governments know this. That is why they watch wheat harvests, export restrictions, reserves, fertilizer supply, shipping lanes, and food price indexes. Wheat is ordinary in a kitchen. It is strategic in a cabinet meeting. A population may depend on wheat grown beyond its borders, shipped through Black Sea corridors it does not control, priced in markets it cannot command, and affected by wars it did not choose. This does not mean wheat is the only staple that matters. Rice, maize, barley, millet, potatoes, and other crops shaped different civilizations in different ways. But wheat became one of the great global grains of states, empires, markets, and geopolitics, from Roman Egypt to the modern Black Sea. Its chain is unusually clear. Wild wheat, grinding stone, storage pit, granary, clay tablet, ration bowl, tax sack, grain ship, Roman warehouse, bread queue, flour cart, grain elevator, futures contract, Black Sea port. At a Black Sea port, grain waits in silos the way it once waited in pits and granaries. Ships wait for safe passage the way Roman ships watched seasons and weather. Governments watch export corridors the way ancient officials watched storehouses. Markets move on rumors and reports the way bread crowds once moved on rumors of hidden grain. The scale has changed, but the dependence on moving grain has not. That is why modern wheat shocks can travel so far. A disruption in one export region can raise pressure in import-dependent countries, strain subsidies, deepen household costs, and turn a distant conflict into a domestic political problem. The Black Sea port is not an isolated modern detail. It is the echo of the Roman port. Mediterranean grain became imperial order. Black Sea grain becomes global food security. The map is larger, but the chain still has weak links. Wheat looks simple, a stalk in a field, a sack in a warehouse, flour on a table, bread in a shop. But history often hides inside ordinary things. At Geopolitics 1, wild grain became food before farming fully took over. In the Jordan Valley, stored grain began to wait under watch. In Mesopotamia, scribes turned cereal harvests into records. In Egypt, officials made grain part of Nile administration. In Rome, Augustus and Claudius treated supply as a problem of state stability. In France, Turgot and Louis XVI learned that bread prices could become a political crisis. In Chicago, the Board of Trade helped turn wheat into contracts. Around the Black Sea, war showed that grain corridors still matter. Wheat did not create civilization alone, but it helped civilization learn some of its most important habits: storage, measurement, taxation, rations, transport, pricing, and dependence. That is why the history of wheat cannot be reduced to bread. Bread is what people held in their hands. Wheat was the chain behind it. The storage pit taught people to guard the future. The clay tablet taught states to count it. The tax sack taught rulers to claim it. The grain ship taught empires to move it. The bread queue taught governments to fear its price. The elevator taught markets to standardize it. The futures contract taught traders to price tomorrow. The Black Sea port reminds us that the chain still exists. And every society, ancient or modern, eventually faces the same question. Will the grain keep moving tomorrow? The early village asked whether the storage pit would last. The scribe asked how much grain the record could claim. The worker asked whether the ration bowl would be filled. Rome asked whether the grain ships would arrive. The French crowd asked whether bread could still be bought. Chicago asked what future wheat would cost. The modern state asks whether ports, corridors, markets, and harvests will hold. Different centuries, different objects, the same pressure, from Rome to the French street, from Chicago to the Black Sea. Wheat is ordinary until it stops moving. Then governments, markets, and crowds are forced to respond.